Dr. Trexler.
Dr. Helms.
We're back, and it's a privilege to have Coach Kassem on from N1 on the podcast, which I'm excited about.
Howdy, guys.
Howdy, howdy. Yeah, so it was not that long ago. It was only a few episodes back, if I am correctly thinking how we're going to release the order of these episodes, that we had Dr. Wes Goodman on, who talked us through a pretty comprehensive look on the field of biomechanics as a whole, everything from motor learning theory and the theoretical constructs that's built upon that aren't necessarily a consensus in the biomechanics world, even among researchers, and an understanding of how we went from cadaver-based research to useful technologies that maybe we over-extrapolated on, like EMG or force plates, and understanding different ways of trying to quantify the forces that the body experiences and produces through ground reaction forces, joint torques, etc., and kind of how he bridged the gap into trying to figure out some things that we can't from those models using modeling, actually constructing models based upon real-world data. And unfortunately, one of the outcomes of his research, guys, was that it seems that the soleus might actually be a major contributor to squat performance. And that is why Omar is not with us here today. He said, I am boycotting iron culture until we have a retraction of that. So we might not be seeing Omar for a while. The good news is that Omar also tends to have a relatively short-term memory on these things, so I suspect he'll forget about this. We'll see him in the future. But we've got myself, Dr. Trexler, and of course, Coach Kassem on. And the beauty of having Coach Kassem on is he is very much focused, would you say more so in the hypertrophy world and the strength performance world of biomechanics?
Yeah, that's probably fair to say.
That's why I really like your content, because, through Berto first and then Brian, and then also just interacting with you directly, I've personally found a lot of your content very helpful as someone who is trying to really turn over every stone in a late stage of my career, trying to be competitive at a high level and, trying to optimize things.
In your golden years, you mean?
In my golden years, yes. As a master's competitor, having recently just turned 41 a few weeks ago. So yeah, I really appreciate your content. Now, one of the things that I think, and this is in the same vein that we've talked about in iron culture, of how there seems to be some pushback and kind of putting kind of all evidence-based or science-based content under the criticism that it's just overcomplicating something that's very basic. We don't need to just go out there, lift hard and heavy. I've seen definitely that being leveled at some of your content before. And I think I don't know if you guys agree with this, but I think one of the major reasons why some content is dismissed as overly sciencey or people get frustrated with it is because people tend to have the view that, look, if this popped up on my phone, on my social media, this content is supposed to be for me. And not all content is made for all people. I actually made a post on Threads, the hottest growing social media platform of all, by the way, where I said, hey, if you find yourself getting annoyed with content that's evidence-based and you see it as overcomplicating things and anxiety-inducing and potentially just wasting time, you probably didn't really have to turn over a ton of stones to see your progress. However, if you really appreciate that content and you get frustrated by people who characterize evidence-based content as overcomplicating things, well, maybe you had to work a little harder, or the stock standard just go hard or go home didn't get you to where you wanted to be, which is, I think, where a lot of us evidence-based people probably to some degree identify with it. Like for me, I'm not going to say I had bad genetics or didn't have good progress initially in the gym, but I had to really start using my brain to get the gains after the newbie phase that I wanted, and to really start taking some approaches that were a little bit outside of the box. So, Kassem, you have done many, 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 many deep dives onto relatively nuanced topics like the specific angle of which you're doing a pull down at, or whether or not You need to reach across the body. Why are you overcomplicating things and ruining the youth's experience with resistance training? That's what I want to know.
So, like, the little clip that I've started saying on this topic is everything matters until it doesn't, and nothing matters until it does. And basically what that means is there's going to be a ton of things that may not matter at any particular time or for a particular person, but that same one thing may be an absolute game changer at a different time or for, another person. One of the straw mans is, that people will say is like, oh, like these guys are just saying, turn your foot 3 degrees on your squat or whatever, and it's going to totally change it. And yeah, maybe turning your toes out 3 degrees isn't going to triple your hypertrophy, but that could be the difference between pain and no pain for somebody. So when it comes to applying some of this stuff, really it's kind of a needs-based application. So you don't know what tools you're going to need for yourself for all of time or for all of your clients. So my goal is just to like fill the toolbox with as many things as there are. Now, some people, they just don't even like to go and look for new tools. They just like to keep using the same ones over and over and over again. And, if that's working for them, that's fine. But my approach is that I would rather have, that information, that tool, that ability to solve that problem, but not have the problem than to have that problem and not have an option or a solution for it. So in the physique world, kind of my history, I started working with competitors around 2008-ish or something. And if you're working with general population, you kind of notice like patterns. You start to get an idea of like, oh, you see somebody and you can already note that you're going to set them up in a particular exercise a certain way, or maybe they're going to fit, or they're going to prefer one thing or the other. It's not even conscious yet, but you just start kind of noticing these things. And then when, I get into physique, it was more, so now I need a result instead of like, I'm just getting an immediate change in experience from the person. And, I don't know if you want me to, how far you want me to go into this, but when I think of like, what is a training program? It's a plan. The point of a plan is basically, if you follow the plan, you'll get to the destination. And as a coach or an athlete, we want to have as much control over the outcome as possible. We want it to be as predictable as possible. We want to look at a training program and like, man, there's all of these variables. How can I start organizing this so that like, I know that if I do X, Y, and Z, that something is a predictable outcome. And I think exercise selection and probably say execution or technique, however you want to frame it, that's basically kind of like, I think the starting point of what determines what the outcome's going to be, because that's kind of like the what that you're going to apply all the quantity-based variables such as like effort and volume and, all the sets and et cetera that you're going to do. So I think, what I'm trying to do is just make things as predictable as possible, like increase the probability that what you're doing is actually going to lead to the result that you want, and also have a whole bunch of tools for when things aren't going the way that you want it. How can I troubleshoot that?
That sounds far more reasonable than I heard that you were, which was just someone who overcomplicated things purposely for the money and the clout, and also just to harm the youth. I think that is a persistent narrative that has been propped up for us science communicators these days. We're clearly just trying to, harm the youth. So no, but in all seriousness,
if I could though, there are a couple things that we haven't mentioned that I think listeners will want to at least, just to kind of paint the whole picture. When I'm making content that is intentionally overcomplicating things, instead of saying all that stuff you guys just said, I say, I'm sorry that you're too dumb to get it. That's usually one way that you could go. Now, if I am trying to take something and really oversimplify it, or if I'm accusing someone else of making things too complicated, then I go with, I believe that you are not tough enough to actually train hard, and that's why you're doing all this nonsense. So just to have like an even balanced conversation, I wanted to enter both of those into the mix, as you were, Holmes.
Yeah, that's actually a staple, is that the more of these nuances apply, the less hard you train. It's kind of an exchange, right?
Yeah.
One biomechanical nuance takes away one effort point, if that makes sense.
Right.
Absolutely. The more you optimize, it actually reduces the RPE. So it's 6 at one, half dozen of the other. No, excellent points. Thank you, Trexler. And in all seriousness, I will say, I think your educational platform, N1 Education, it really does speak to what you're talking about. It is results oriented. It's focused on the individual, and a lot of this is experience oriented. So talk to us a little bit more about like what it is you do, and a little bit on your background for anyone who isn't familiar with you. Now that they kind of get an idea of your philosophy and the fact that you're, working on exercise execution, selection, biomechanics, and how that fits into programs specifically for more physique competitors. But obviously that's not all you do. I know you do a fair amount of trainer education as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, my formal education background actually started in like biochemistry and exercise physiology. I was a super physiology nerd. My first job was kind of actually looking into like research on like PEDs and pathways and stuff like that. And it's like, as a supplement to that, I started coaching. And very quickly you kind of realize that like, okay, yeah, cool. Biochemistry is not necessarily having a massive impact on the decisions I need to make on the gym floor with these people. And so I started gravitating a lot towards more people that were teaching practical. And so I went into the private sector, and that kind of like, we'll say, fueled the drive to just learn as many disciplines as I can. Everything from applied kinesiology to biomechanics to looking more into physics and stuff like that. And physics, I think, just kind of came naturally to me because I did construction as a kid. So like, you're already kind of like doing something quote unquote close to like some applied engineering. And so I just started realizing that like, man, I'm using this stuff, very often and, on a day-to-day basis. It becomes very practical. And that just made me want to learn more and more and more of the nuances of that. And over time, I essentially got to the point where in order for me to talk to any other coach about, we'll say, any other training variable, programming, et cetera, all of a sudden there was like a communication gap because they didn't have the physics or the anatomy or et cetera for me to be able to say, this is why I'm choosing this exercise or this order or et cetera. And I've looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find like a good educational resource where people could gather all this information in one place, or we'll say relatively easy or fast. The biomechanics field in general is not necessarily, made for resistance training. Majority of biomechanical research is not for the bros trying to put on muscle. In fact, most of the questions that they're trying to answer are far more complex, whereas like for hypertrophy, we're looking at actually simplifying the physics and the exercise equation. And oftentimes like most of like the stuff that you would do if you wanted to go get a formal education biomechanics is kind of outside the realm of what you'd be looking at if you're really just trying to figure out, hey, how should I perform this bicep curl? So eventually just led me down the road of like, hey, if you want something done right, do it yourself. And that's where, starting N1 Education came. So basically, I decided to put together what I thought was the most essential things to be like that you needed to know to be able to write really good programs. And after a few years of like doing that, I was like, well, we can actually start, pushing this forward and answering some of the questions that we don't have answers to if we start kind of doing the research ourselves. And that's when we started actually like investing in getting lab equipment and stuff and being like, okay, cool. Here's what we currently have. Where can we fill in the gaps? And also like a big part of what we did is we looked at most of the existing, we'll say like EMG research and some of the applied studies. And we're like, okay, let's reproduce these. And then let's try and break the protocol and see if there are any limitations or whatnot. And that really kind of opened the door for me to understand that area of research better. Because I think if you just read EMG studies and you're not really familiar with using it, or, you're looking at something like a lot of people don't understand, like the NIRS devices and stuff like that. But if you're just reading about the technologies and you don't really understand how they work, or the extreme limitations they have, or the challenges of the protocol that you have to make to actually get a good study design, it can become very hard to know whether you're reading something that this is good quality or bad quality. And so that was kind of like, that's the next area. And that's kind of where we're at now, is like, okay, how can we continue to fill the gaps beyond what we currently have, you know, in the published research, so that we can fill in the gaps of our curriculum and give us, we'll say, the best suggestions that we can. You know, granted, we're using mostly proxy. So if you're not familiar with what we do in-house, we don't do like long-term hypertrophy applied research, at least not yet. But we look at basically every proxy that I've been able to purchase at this point, you know. And I think that the way that we're looking at it, because we have we'll say it's pretty much all very trained individuals, and the technique standards and stuff like that, we'll say it's very contextual to the people that we're speaking, you know, and communicating that information to. And we also try and bridge the gap where we get to let our students experience and be a part of that research when they come to the event, which I think also just kind of gives them a little bit of buy-in into the evidence-based space, but also just kind of also opens up the door of curiosity for them as well. And we're like, the thing that we're kind of focusing on now is trying to develop as many, we'll say, N of 1 experiments that you could do yourself to inform your training, but actually doing something tangible rather than, all right, do this for 12 weeks and see if it works for you. Like, well, what could I do in a session or a couple sessions and actually get some informed data? So that's kind of been my journey, is like, all right, the problem is it's a communication problem, to now like, hey, how can we advance the field by doing kind of our own research?
I want to acknowledge that you and your concept sense in a space that I would imagine the critiques you get are sometimes frustrating, because you can get them from quote unquote both ends. And what I mean by that is that you're, like you said, there's very few practitioners in the like exercise execution applied anatomy space who have, you know, near infrared spectroscopy, EMG, and are doing, you know, biomechanical analyses in their in-house. Like they're mostly just saying, here's some principles, here's what we think works well, and here's the pitch, and buy my course, right? And that can be good or it can be bad, but there is a lot of charlatanry in the or pseudoscience or just old science in the space that you operate in, that can look to someone who's not educated similar to the same stuff you're doing, you know? Like there was a time, because I'm not a biomechanics expert, where, and I think everybody kind of felt this way, it's like Kelly Starrett was like a god, like supple leopard, you know, if people were around, like, and, you know, he's got these videos of like, okay, hold your hand out, tuck your chin, now put your tongue on the roof of your mouth. Do you feel that? Totally different, you know? And like, he was just a really good salesman. And some of it was just that he came from an older era of physical therapy, but some of it, when you were looking back on it, I'm like, that's just nonsense, you know? And this is not a shot at Kelly Starrett or saying that he couldn't do good work or anything like that, or there wasn't good information. But even, I'm just saying that since 2011, when I remember seeing that content and just not really having the same general understanding we have of biomechanics, applied anatomy, pain, injury, all that, and then also just my own personal evolution of learning more, I look back and I go, oh man, like I see how that can be quite attractive. And some of the things that you can do in person with someone and then videotape it, it does change the experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is how things are operating or how they work. So your content can appear like that, even though you're doing things in a much more kind of contextual, evidence-based way with actually collecting data. And then at the same time as well, you are sometimes getting the critiques from the more science, like actually entrenched scientific community, because you're not actually doing, say, like a university-funded or not, or, you know, university-based longitudinal trial looking at actual outcomes. And something that like myself and Trex have often told people is, hey, proxies are great, but they are proxies. So don't over-extrapolate on EMG. Don't over-extrapolate on muscle protein synthesis. Don't over-extrapolate on X, Y, and Z. And another type of critique you'll see is, hey, that's just an observational study. You know, correlation doesn't equal causation. This is a huge issue we have in the nutrition world, and we've talked about it before, like in the low-carb community. they're happy to pitch an observational trial that supports their information. But then if you talk about a huge epidemiological observation of saying, hey, like it seems like vegetables are good, it's like, well, that's just, observational data and, show me the RCT. So it's a challenging space in biomechanics where people don't understand the logistical challenge of saying, right, if we want to actually say that this type of exercise is better than that type of exercise long term, you have to have head-to-head comparisons of these different exercises, almost in isolation, which is not the way training programs work, looking at longitudinal adaptations, and then, having a sufficient N, controlling for all these other variables. And it would take literal decades to compare every single one of the variations of bodybuilding exercises that are out there. So searching for proxies is actually a really worthwhile thing to do. And I think sometimes people in the evidence-based community who kind of maybe are really sympathetic to that message that Trexler and I have, their immediate thought is like, okay, that's all just speculation based upon these proxy measures, and they just kind of reject it. But I would just want to put forth that just because something has limitations or it is a proxy for an outcome doesn't mean we jettison it. Doesn't mean we let go of it. Like, we're not going to stop doing muscle protein synthesis research, nor should we. We're not going to stop doing EMG research, nor should we. We're not going to stop doing epidemiology. And these are really useful tools when it is challenging to do the actual longitudinal trial. And just to give a shout out to my recently arrived student, Takahiro Itagaki, who came from Japan, his PhD, you're going to love this, Kassem. I mentioned him to you a few years ago, but COVID delayed when he actually got out here. He's going to be doing acute proxy assessments of comparative hypertrophy exercises, looking at MOXIE, so muscle oxygenation through near-infrared spectroscopy, EMG, to look at the acute surface electromyography, acute swelling via ultrasound to see the immediate objective, quote-unquote, swelling response, and then also a bunch of Likert scale-based questions related to fatigue, damage, effort, all that stuff in the time course. Probably doing it within subject design, randomizing limbs to doing these different exercises that are thought to have different hypertrophic potential based upon their biomechanics. Also getting some, force time data, impulse, all that good stuff. And then they're going to, within subject design, get randomized into comparing these head to head and looking at actual longitudinal hypertrophy and saying, did any of these proxies actually predict that? So there's absolutely value in that. And some of what you're doing in-house is part of a PhD project that we're doing here at AUT. So I want to just help people understand that there is a really important role for this evidence-informed, in the trenches, kind of N1 approach, like you've said, of trying to help people use more objective metrics to get a better gauge of what might be effective. And kind of sitting in either one of those kind of sides of the spectrum and not acknowledging the other, it's going to ultimately just restrict the tools you have available to you. So anyway, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I think I've said my piece there, but I just want to let people kind of have an insight into what the limitations are of the epistemology, really, how we get knowledge and why it is important to have this kind of middle ground of let's get in the trenches and try with an evidence-informed approach to figure out what might be a way to optimize these exercises.
Yeah, we basically spend the first half of the first day at our biomechanics course going over how what are these technologies actually measuring, what their limitations are, and then we go through a bunch of examples where the technologies succeed and fail. And what I've tried to do is use as many examples that we have in the applied research where we actually have like an applied outcome, and showing and explaining like why we would expect the technology to either succeed or fail in this given thing, right? So, because it's very different to compare the hip thrust to a squat versus comparing, two different wrist orientations and a bicep curl and things like that. And that's basically what we do. And then we kind of explain the reason that we're using so many of these things simultaneously because of the fact that they're all imperfect. But that kind of the reason that, we'll say so invested in the proxies, not just because we'll say knowing that they're imperfect, the reason I am is because when it comes to trying to actually have a discussion on, we'll say, nuanced or detailed biomechanics, there's such a gap in knowledge, whether it's anatomy or physics or whatnot. And so one of the main reasons that we have these is so like we can create interest in some of this stuff without you having to read, 3 or 4 pages of physics to understand the rationale of why we're doing exercise. Like, I mean, it's as simple as, hey, on social media, if I have 2 lines and one's higher than the other, people are going to be like, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to give that a try. But if I say, hey, okay, so if we're looking at this, you need, if we internally rotate it, this happens, and I go on and tell this whole story of physical biomechanics, I'm going to lose a lot of people. And that's where more of the pushback of like, oh, you're overcomplicating it. I'm like, well, explaining it seems complicated, but doing it is actually super simple. All I'm saying is just set the cable here and pull on it, right? Like it's really that simple. But I think the like closing that gap, having some of these things that are visually stimulating has helped us get more people kind of interested and willing to, we'll say, invest in learning and understanding that stuff a little bit more. But it is a constant battle to be pushing out the limitations at the same time you're presenting that information, which is just, it's something we just have to repeat over and over and over again.
Well said. So with that kind of, I think we have an understanding of the landscape of what are we trying to know here, right? One of the things that we talked a lot about in the episode with Wes is, how do we optimize for strength and performance? I do think hypertrophy is somewhat of a different animal. Obviously, they're related, and if you make a muscle bigger, you'd think it would be able to produce more force. But from your perspective, what are the characteristics of an exercise that is useful or ideal or beneficial for hypertrophy, and what's your schema of thinking of that?
So if I have to put it in like one sentence, right?
You can have a few sentences. This podcast does go for an hour and a half sometimes, so you can feel free.
If I start with that, it's that the target muscle or target muscles that you're trying to stimulate are the thing that actually leads to the momentary or your desired level of failure in the exercise. Like if you had to put like one thing around it, it literally is like, hey, the thing that I'm going for, that's actually going to be the thing that causes me to reach failure. And like the analogy I like to give is like, say you had like a really big, strong guy and 2 little kids that were pushing a car. When the big, strong guy gets tired, even though maybe the kids were helping a little bit, it's just like, okay, it's going to stop, right? We're just not going to move anymore. And so that's kind of what we want to have when we're like choosing an exercise, especially if we're trying to be, we'll say, very specific with the tissue that we're targeting, is we want to have it set so that, hey, once that primary muscle is fatigued, that it was so well leveraged, that the motion was so specific to it, that basically that's what leads to the failure. Because if we have that, a lot of the things that we're going to looking for in terms of the physiology are going to correlate under that. So I think if we take this, like that question of like, what do we want from the biomechanics perspective or exercise perspective, but we look at it through the same lens that we would look at from the physiological perspective. Like, what are the principles that we're thinking about from a hypertrophy exercise? We want it to have a certain volume. We want to accumulate a certain volume of mechanical tension. We want to get to a certain proximity to failure. Maybe, especially now, you're thinking about muscle length and, where it's hard in the exercise, and you're thinking about those qualities. So if we choose exercises where the target tissue is the thing that's getting fatigued, well, we know we're accumulating mechanical tension there, right? And we know that, like, when we know the RAR or the degree of failure that we're going to correlates well to the primary muscle in that case, because you can have plenty of instances where you do an exercise and the like individual muscle RAR is very different, even though they're all kind of synergistically working together. And, one like a cool way that you can test this yourself is if you do like a compound exercise, you can actually test how it affects the performance of, say, an isolation exercise. Like if you're doing a pressing variation, you could immediately go over and see, well, okay, how many repetitions do I lose at a given load of a tricep extension if I do this first. And that can kind of give you an idea of like, well, how much fatigue did I actually generate in that other exercise? And you can use that as somewhat informative of like, oh, okay, so when I'm, maybe if I'm pressing with a wider grip on the barbell, or I'm using a fixed handled machine where I can leverage my triceps more, I'm fatiguing those muscles more, versus if I'm using a dumbbell or cable where I don't have that opportunity, I'm actually getting a lot less tricep volume in that press. And that could help me inform like, okay, probably if I'm pressing this way, I could decrease my my direct work a little bit more, or here I would increase it a little bit more, right? And so I'm looking at that as kind of like the most important thing, because if you have that, there's just a lot of assumptions that we can probably make with that. Because we could sit here and we could talk about neuromechanical matching, and we could talk about, okay, I need a certain degree of activation, and all of those things are going to come along for the ride if we know that tissue is actually the tissue that is getting fatigued, if that makes sense. So I don't know how detailed you want me to go down that explanation. So I started with the simplest one that I could think of.
No, I like it. And let me provide the devil's advocate response that some camps, maybe the more minimalist, compound-based kind of focused approach would say, well, hold on. Like if we take that philosophy too far, now we're trying to isolate everything, and we end up having to do maybe more work and be less efficient than if we just focused on compound exercises that they have a fair amount of overlap. But if you focus just on the big compounds, a vertical push, a vertical pull, a horizontal push, a horizontal pull, a squat, a hinge, and maybe a couple isolation exercises when no one's looking. But and then just load up on those, doesn't that get me more efficiently to be able to train from maybe a time perspective? And I don't have to worry about all this kind of, what exercise is being biased. I think that could be a response to kind of that philosophy of what's a good hypertrophy exercise. Because someone else could say, well, hold on, why don't you choose an exercise that trains a whole lot of, the body at once and produces a lot of stimulus for multiple tissues? Like, the squat is the king of the lower body exercises, or there are even why people think a deadlift might be a good hypertrophy exercise.
See, I don't see that as an opposing view. I just think that you need to look at this through the goal that you have in mind. So if my goal is a specific muscle, then I want that to disproportionately fatigue relative to everything else. If my goal is multiple muscles, especially like the more balanced I want to have it, the more I want the fatigue to be somewhat equal amongst those. So take a squat, for example. You can set up a squat so that your knees are pushed away from your center of mass, like really far forward. And that's going to limit how much glute and, erector fatigue that you're going to get in the exercise, because you're going to be more upright and we're going to have to produce way more torque at the knee. And you could do the opposite. You could shift your hips way back and load the hips more, or you could do something balanced in between. None of those are the right way to squat. Those are just three different goal ways to squat. And you could use something like that post-exhaust like test as a way of evaluating how well your squat currently fatigues your quads versus your glutes, for example. You could be like, okay, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go do an extension on a multi-hip or a thrust or something, and look like, oh, okay, should I actually adjust my technique to be a little bit more knees forward? Should I use a higher heel elevation, right? Or should I sit back a little bit more, et cetera? Like all of these are options. So you could see how it compares with the, say you have a pendulum squat and you hack squat, and you're like, equal preference. You could be like, well, how could I kind of get an idea today of like what my relative, like, am I getting the same amount of quad hip ratio in those? You could try and calculate the mechanics of it, or you could simply be like, hey, I'm just going to try both of these and see which one has a greater impact. Could you use something like soreness as a proxy? I think a post-exhaust or something that's more tangible is a little bit better, especially when you account for novelty and all the other things that can affect, soreness and recovery. But so I look at say a lot of people would look at, say, like Dr. Mike Israetel's content, and they would look at my content, and they would be like, oh, these guys have two polar opposite approaches, because a lot of Mike's exercises are very big exercises. And, a lot of the content that I put on tends to be like, hey, here's how to target this portion of the lat or something. In reality, it's like I use a lot of those exercises too when the goal is to train multiple tissues, right? But from an information perspective, I can't add a lot of information of like, hey, yeah, this exercise works a whole bunch of body parts and here's the 72 different techniques that you could use it versus me saying, hey, if here's one thing and here's one way to target that one thing. That's the content that I've kind of leaned for because I feel like I can provide education that's useful in a very short time frame versus if I put out, we'll say, a complex exercise where I have to talk about all the variables, I'm just not going to have the attention span on these platforms. So my content is kind of gravitated towards showing more of the biased exercises. And that's just kind of worked out well for us. But you can apply, I want to work multiple muscles or fewer muscles. And when it comes to the efficiency argument, I always find it interesting how, we'll say, lazy the programming thought is when it comes to this, because people be like, oh, I can't do unilateral exercises. It takes too much time. And I'm like, well, you could adjust their rest intervals, or you could do some sort of I can train biceps and triceps. And if I want to do unilateral, I'll do like right, left, and go through, and it will take me the same amount of time, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do in programming where you can solve things. And even if you're squatting, guess what? It's still not going to be a great hamstring exercise. So you're either going to do squats and leg curls, right? Or you could be like, oh, well, what if I want to do leg extensions because I want more rec fem? Because if I do squats and leg curls, I don't get a lot of rec fem. But if I do leg extensions, and say like RDLs, well, I'm still getting quads in that, but maybe I'm not getting the glute in the lengthened position, or you can go through and it's like, all right, there's always going to be pros and cons, and you can mix and match and do all sorts of things. So to me, the more specific your goals are, and then if you just put a little thought into the programming, you have like so many ways that you can solve a problem, whether it be with a lot of exercise or like very few exercises, and still be time efficient. I've always thought that like having to use compounds to save time is just a lazy way of looking at programming, because I can do a tricep isolation and a pec isolation, and I don't have to rest as much between those versus me doing 2 compound presses. I can literally get it done in the same amount of time, right? So to me, it's like, that's just lazy if you're thinking that the only way to save time is to use big compound exercises. I'm not saying the isolation one is better per se. I'm just saying that you have those options as long as you're willing to put in a little bit of work on the X's and O's of the program.
Yeah, I think a fair bit of that is also people don't really, they're not as familiar with applying concepts of time saving in an evidence-based perspective. Like we actually just released a whole guide for mass for antagonist paired sets, drop sets, rest pause, and other programming strategies. And I can't tell you, like I post my workouts just on my story, and I'm always showing the screenshot of how I'm getting through, if you count every drop, every rest pause as a single set, I'm typically getting through an average of 30 sets in an hour to an hour and 20. And it blows people's minds. And I am in pretty good cardiovascular shape for one, but and I'm acclimated to it. But I don't have rep drop-offs. Like I maintain very consistent performance. And people are thinking, oh, you must be sandbagging your RPEs. And I'm like, pretty sure I'm not. Here's a video, But the way I do it is through exactly what we're talking about, as doing good exercise pairings, drop sets, antagonist paired sets. And I just think the average person in the evidence-based community, they kind of have like the high-level stock standard understanding of, listen, like it's not about growth hormone response or just the metabolic fatigue. It makes more sense to rest longer. And that's not untrue, but there are many ways to ensure that at least the target tissue is resting so long as you're in sufficient cardiorespiratory shape. That doesn't mean just sitting there for 3 minutes until your next set on the next exercise. So that's one minor point. The other thing I would say is that was an excellent answer. I think I fully agree. And that level of nuance, I think, is sometimes missing, especially when people come to it from the perspective of, listen, here's how you train. You do your compounds and you do your isolations. And that's what makes sense. And then the final thing I would say is that there's a different audience for those two different approaches too. Like when I was first getting into lifting, and we know that kind of everything will grow in response to pretty much anything, I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of focus on the big compound lifts and not needing quite as much nuance. But like when you're working with physique athletes and people who are like the people who have engaged with and popularized some of your content, I think unsurprisingly, it's competitive athletes in physique sport at a high level who are like, crap, how do I make this muscle group grow? Because that will be the difference in my physique improving. So like, for example, Alberto Nunez needing to figure out a way to make his back wider, me figuring out a way to get more growth out of my medial delt, and seeing those kinds of outcomes. That's a fundamentally different question than Alberto Nunez or Eric Helms had in 2005, when we only had a few years of lifting under our belts. And that is a pretty consistent question among advanced athletes. How do I grow X? Because I've now developed enough muscle mass to see a quote unquote weak point. Versus someone who starts, it's like, how do I grow as much muscle as fast as possible everywhere? And that kind of comes back to my earlier point of like, not all content, unfortunately, is perfectly curated for you just because you saw it on your phone or your laptop.
I do think sometimes people sleep on where you can implement this stuff with beginners. And I think that's something that we'll say the people that are still working in person get a lot of value out of this. So, I mean, not everybody, especially a beginner, especially with today's general population, is going to be able to come in and do a squat proficiently enough to get, significant benefit from it. So being able to like break that squat up into pieces and build a foundational strength and we'll say an aerobic base and get all of those things done before then you try and have them learn that complex movement pattern. There's a lot of use cases for this stuff, especially when you're working around, injuries or people that, it hurts when I use a barbell or I can't even get my arms to be, so there's so many opportunities like kind of at both extremes. It's to me, if like there's a group that like is less interested, it's like, hey, I'm young and I'm fit and I can just jump in and do things. That to me is like, that's the group that maybe kind of skips over this. But it's people that have any sort of limitations. They're like, oh, wow, cool. I don't have to do this. I have this other alternative. And then it's the people looking for that higher level specialization for physique. So it's kind of like the two ends that I see are the most interested in kind of get the most mileage out of like kind of like that breaking it up using more biased exercise approach.
No, I think that totally makes sense. Yeah. Trexler, you and I have both been public about some of the ouchies we've had and the injury limitations. I don't know about you, but some of the more important things that I think come up with any kind of lifter who's been at it for a while is working around their own structural limitations and prior injuries. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think especially that becomes huge, obviously on your own, when you're just kind of organizing your own training, you're going to run into things you have to train around very tactfully and strategically. It may be due to injury. It may just be because of the way your body's shaped. And you're just like, well, that felt weird. That's not the move for me. And you start to adjust some things. But then you kind of amplify that if you happen to get into coaching. And now you have to do that, for every one of your athletes. And that's where, just tremendous communication, observation, trial and error becomes huge. And I'm sure every coach wished that they could sneak into the N1 lab there and grab some of those tools, meet up with their client, take some measurements. But obviously that's not always it's almost never going to be feasible for the typical online coach. But yeah, definitely, I completely agree.
So that was something I did want to talk to you as well about, Kassem. It's like, I'll use a personal example. So you have these kind of intersection of variables that ends up making a certain approach better or worse for someone. And then they have different constraints as to their ability to carry it out. So for me, I seem to have this consistent pattern where I need a lot more work in my upper body. My upper body tends to be much more fatigue resistant. I don't get as much DOMS. I can perform 9, 10 RPE, 0, 1 RIR at a given load at a given rep. And then in a short rest period, I can repeat it. And it's the kind of thing as a coach, when I see a client send that to me, I'm like, yeah, that probably wasn't really a 9 RPE on the first set. But I know people exist out there like me. In lower body, I'm not like that. And then it also seems that I need almost twice the amount of volume in my upper body versus my lower body. But then unfortunately, I also get elbow tendonitis. And it's like, well, shit. Like, I'm also, I turn 41 and how do I get there? So I have to think about things like, BFR or neutral grip or et cetera, et cetera. How do you operate with athletes in situations like that where some of the, you have to take like a constraints-led approach almost rather than a principle-based approach? And I imagine that's baked into kind of the N1 mindset.
I mean, I would say the principles carry over fairly well when, at least the way that we look at it, because we don't look at an exercise like, say, an incline bench press, right? We don't look at it through the lens of the degree the bench is at. We look at it as, okay, the arm relative to the rib cage. So you could have an athlete that's got a very steep rib cage. You could have somebody who's got a very flat rib cage. They gotta lay on the same bench angle. It's basically two different movements. Like one person's incline press is another person's flat. If we're looking at actually what is happening from a muscular and a joint perspective, even though the bench angle changes. So a lot of solving these problems is actually just usually taking somebody from a technique that wasn't standardized to their structure and standardizing it, looking at through the lens to their structure. And I mean, if it's standardized to your structure, that's going to limit a lot of, we'll say, uncomfortable joint positions and stuff like that. And it's going to put you in a place where you have better leverages, easier to get into ranges of motion, et cetera, right off the bat. Then from there, if needed, then cool, then we can introduce more constraints. That, I would say the majority of, niggles or limitations are solved simply from just individualizing exercises. And then it's people that have had some sort of chronic thing been going on where okay, there's some actual damage or residual inflammation, et cetera, that we can't just put you in the right path and you're instantly going to feel better. You're actually going to need either time away from these forces or strains that then, okay, cool, now we can introduce some constraints, and sometimes often it is sometimes simply just having doing the better version of the motion is actually the thing that seems to be providing the most resolution, right? So it's okay, I have pain when I press. Well, it might be that actually pressing better is almost therapeutic. And then in other cases, it might be okay, we literally need to use a load management strategy, or we need to break this up into more isolated components to be able to train those tissues, right? But for a lot of people, I would say simply just moving better seems to ease a lot of the ills of moving bad.
No, I've definitely experienced that. So yeah, do you want to dive deeper into some of the ways you think about good exercises, quote unquote, for hypertrophy? So I know you started with the one sentence version. Do you think it's worth getting a little more into the weeds?
Yeah. So if I break it up into the principles, specificity is the key principle we use both from an exercise selection and technique. And specificity basically means if we look at the motion, how specific is that motion to the action of that muscle in that context, right? So the simplest view, and this is kind of where I pull away from some of the modeling. So I've done a lot of modeling. I probably have a more critical view of the modeling than your previous guest, Wes. And at least in terms of when it comes down to our ability to predict muscle force and muscle attributes, the amount of variables that we have to put into those models that we're essentially just estimating and then hoping so I think that there are looking at maybe moment arms and looking at the change in muscle length, we can get some valuable stuff out of that from a hypertrophy perspective. But I don't think the force data is accurate enough for me to use. So when I'm looking at specificity, I've kind of simplified it as we look at okay, how can I take a muscle from the most stretched position that I can get it and then move in the direction of shortening for that muscle, accounting for both its line of action and the joint mechanics. And the more specific almost always pretty much perfectly correlates to that's actually going to be where that muscle has the best leverage, right? Because it tends to correlate hey, if it's along that muscle's action path, it's also going to have its greatest internal leverages there as well. And then the other thing to consider is the specificity, especially when we're talking about things across multiple joints. So some people will look at, say, the concept of neuromechanical matching, which is something we need a lot more research on. But basically the principle is the thing that has the best leverage to do a motion is what our body's going to recruit, which seems to make sense, right? That would be an energy conservation model, which, most processes and adaptations have some sort of energy currency to them. And I'd be yeah, why would I expend more energy to do the same motion if I didn't have to? So if we're looking at that, a lot of times that doesn't get looked at in multiple dimensions. It gets looked at, it's like in a 2D perspective. Somebody will be like, oh, hey, here's the leverages, and they'll post like a momentum chart or whatnot, and not take into account the forces at another joint, or sometimes different forces at the same joint. So for instance, if we look at the elbow and we're talking about the biceps, okay, well, the biceps are both elbow flexors, but they're also supinators. So if I do a curl, but while I'm doing that curl, I pronate, I'm doing the opposite action for the biceps while also doing an action for the biceps. The net result there probably is that I'm going to use a lot less biceps to do that elbow flexion versus the other elbow flexor. So it's the brachialis is basically going to probably take a lot more load. And that's what we see in the proxies that we have. Same thing if I were to do the opposite motion at the shoulder, whereas it's like I was doing a row motion that included elbow flexion. Well, I'm doing the opposite motion of the biceps as they both cross the shoulder and would both be relative shoulder flexors. Probably, again, where I'm shifting the bias a little bit way. So when we look at specificity, it's got to be specificity as a whole, accounting for all joints. This is why we see hamstrings aren't great for squats, and rec fem is not also good because there's an opposing action. So I think specificity that's probably the primary principle, and you have to kind of set a certain threshold. Like a motion has to be specific enough for that tissue before I worry about muscle length and range of motion and all the other things, right? So that's my primary principle. It's got to be specific enough. And then again, that can exist on a spectrum between whether I want to work multiple muscles or really target this one thing. The next principle I'm looking at is actually the muscle length and range of motion. And with that, we're talking physiological length. So a lot of times range of motion is talked about in the constraints of an exercise, right? So if it's like, okay, I'm doing full range of motion, it's just that you're meeting the top and bottom of whatever that exercise allows. If you're doing a barbell press, you're not fully shortening your pecs. You're just stopping when you can't adduct the arms anymore. But full range of motion would actually bring in the arms all the way across the body. So when I'm thinking principles, I'm looking at where does this exercise sit on that physiological length, not what part of the exercise am I necessarily using? Because you could do a lengthened partial in one exercise and you're working in the mid-range, and you could do a lengthened partial in another exercise and you're actually working at its longest possible muscle length. And, at least from what we're seeing now, I think I would lean towards doing the lengthened partial, but also being at a longer muscle length. Like those two would kind of work together. The third principle is resistance challenge, not to be confused with resistance profile for any of the nerds that are listening to this. And I think that's important because resistance profile or resistance curve is where the external resistance is greatest, but that doesn't always reflect that that's actually where you're experiencing the most relative challenge, because you could be very strong in that position. So take something like a T-bar row or you can call them a landmine row or whatever. Technically, the resistance profile of the exercise is more lengthened biased. It's got a longer moment in the stretch position. But relative to your strength, it's still a short challenge exercise because you get weaker as you shorten way faster than the external resistance gets lighter. So we use challenge, and it's basic because basically that's what we're concerned about is the relationship between your strength and the external resistance. So it's not about just that the external resistance is harder in the lengthened position. It has to be relatively harder to your actual strength level in that position. And then accordingly, relatively easier in the short position if we're focusing on hypertrophy. Okay. Now, I do think that I'm in the mind that I'm not ready to throw out short exercises yet. And, if you want to get at that too, we can. But right now, if you pigeonhole me into I have to pick one exercise that's going to perform against another exercise for hypertrophy, I do sit on the longer side of muscle length and the longer side of resistance challenge. So those for hypertrophy, those kind of sit as our kind of 2 and 3 principle. And then our fourth principle is the stability and the coordination demand, right? And I put those two together because they're very similar, and oftentimes in explaining them, it actually becomes harder to differentiate the two to a student versus just kind of lumping them together. And so that's going to be how challenging it is to balance, how many joints are involved, how many total muscles, am I actually having to stimulate during this exercise? And what we see is that basically we're able to get a little bit more out of a muscle if we don't have to do anything other than manage that one muscle and a single joint. The more things, what it does is not only does it decrease our maximal force output, but it increases our perceived effort of that challenge. So it can introduce an error to our RPE or RIR as an exercise becomes more challenging from a stability or coordination standpoint. And that especially comes into play if there's any sort of respiratory challenge where it's like it becomes harder to breathe and whatnot. And some exercises have a little bit more of an occlusion effect than others, especially depending on the tempo, et cetera, that you're using. So all those things can not only influence force production, but they can really influence your gauge of RPE and RIR. So from a hypertrophy perspective, we can kind of minimize the impact of those. Then we know, like, hey, if we're shooting for this proximity to failure, we're really getting there. And it's not just that like the exercise itself is just hard from a perceived effort standpoint. And we have to decide, hey, all right, well, it's because this is a tough exercise. Am I going to do that rep that I normally wouldn't do? And these exercises tend not to be the exercises where you should be playing the high risk game anyway, because they tend to be the exercises where there's likely a chance that if you miss them or whatnot, that you will say, if it's unstable, you probably have a greater likelihood of injuring yourself, failing in an unstable versus a very stable exercise where you could very easily stop and be done. Right?
No,
so those are the four principles that we kind of have. And then essentially, if you want to interject here, you can. Then I can tell you kind of how we apply those. But basically, in a perfect world, you just be able to find exercises that meet all of those. But in the real world, that's just not the case, right? So you're going to have sometimes you could have an exercise where it's like, okay, cool, this is at a long muscle length, but it's not very stable. And this one is like, okay, cool, it's got a good resistance challenge, but the muscle isn't as stretched. And so basically what we try and teach people is like, all right, we need a certain specificity threshold. And then we're trying to kind of figure out where do we prioritize these other things, or how do we use multiple exercises to maybe, accomplish checking all the boxes with multiple things. And then also kind of how can we leverage programming to kind of overcome the limitations of those. So take, for example, something, all right, so say we have something where muscle length and resistance challenge is not something that we can optimize. Maybe that's where we can implement, pauses or lengthened partials or something like that to kind of leverage a little bit more of the lengthened portion of the exercise. Or maybe it's an exercise where there's a stability or a coordination demand. Can we incorporate, do we need to just change the absolute loading to make that exercise more feasible to do? Or can we use a pre or a post exhaust type method? So one thing that I'll commonly do is I will take an exercise, like we'll say glutes is a really popular one. We'll take a leg press and we'll position that for the glutes. But the leg press, you're still going to use some quads and you're going to use some adductor and whatnot, right? So it's not as isolated to the glutes, but it's a very stable exercise and it's going to be challenging in the lengthened position. And it's a relatively long muscle length. If we contrast that to, say, a cable, press back or kickback exercise, where it's like we can make this very specific to the glute, we can kind of move in a path that's going to make it less, adductor, and quads just, other than the stabilizing leg, really aren't going to be doing much. But if I have a strong person and they're trying to do a cable press back or kickback, the machine may not even have enough load, or they might be lifting themselves off the ground, or simply stabilizing that much load just may be not feasible. But if I do that exercise in a post-exhaust fashion where I go with the more stable but less specific leg press first, and then I can go in and I can do that kickback exercise or press back exercise that's now very specific, I can kind of extend the stimulus in the glutes without continuing on the stimulus in the quads and the adductors, and I've somewhat limited the impact of the stability and coordination demand, right? So it's like, if I have weaknesses in exercises, is there things I can do in my programming to kind of accommodate for some of those weaknesses? Do I have a peer-reviewed study that says that's, better? No. But do I think that taking those two things to kind of make one super exercise, you could call it a superset, that that probably is better than watching somebody like, struggle to like stabilize the kickback thing, or just being like, hey, I know you came only for glutes, but best I can do is just bigger legs, right? Like, to me, it's like, okay, this probably is going to be a better solution, even though I don't have the longitudinal evidence to show it. Observationally, I've seen very good outcomes just finding ways to make up for the limitations of exercises with programming, variables.
I got a specific, go for it, Drex.
Yeah, so I was wondering, you mentioned the, peer-reviewed articles and say, well, I don't really have one to support this. One thing that's always, I tend to stay in my lane and do more physiology, nutrition, metabolism. But as a coach, you wear a lot of different hats. But I don't dig into a lot of the biomechanics research. But one thing that's always struck me as a bit odd is a very enthusiastic willingness to take group level data from completely untrained people and say, well, now we know biomechanically what a front squat looks like. And when I think about, there was a time in my life where I was pretty good at squatting, and I was like, you know what? I don't squat anything like an untrained person, because I've seen a lot of untrained people squatting. I used to coach 8th graders, right? And I've taught them back squats and front squats. So now that you have a lot of individual level data, and you've worked with a lot of really experienced athletes, how dumb am I for feeling like there's a pretty huge limitation to actually implementing some of these kind of group level averages, specifically in untrained people? Because if we're trying to think, how does an athlete move? Probably want to look at an athlete, right?
Well, I would say you're so dumb that it's like circled around to being genius is actually the way that I would phrase it.
Good.
It's going to be very dependent on the exercise, right? So a squat is a complex exercise with a lot of degrees of freedom, so if we're looking at exercises where basically you got to get a bar from point A to point B, and you can do it a lot of different ways, well, then there's going to be a ton of individual variance. And when we're looking at squats, you can have somebody not do the same squat in any 2 reps in a set, right? So the body can have a different solution for every rep. Now, as we simplify the exercise, now all of a sudden, not only do the reps look similar for the same individual, but they start to look similar across individuals, right? So if we're looking at isolating elbow flexion, what works in one person is pretty much going to be that way in another person, okay? At least to a much higher degree. When we're looking at something like a squat, not only is it going to be the training age, et cetera, but a lot of it's like you could have people that are equally trained, but they've trained with varying techniques. You could have people that have different anthropomorphics, right? You could have people that have simply just been exposed to different weight ranges. So the squatting technique that you will have for a triple versus, a set of 12 will actually change. And it should, if like your body's actually leveraging your mechanics and your capacity well, right? Because if what you have to do as you get closer and closer to your max loads is you do like the weak links in there because like you have like no rooms for error. But all of a sudden as we're working with like lower loads, we can rely on some less fatigued synergistic tissues to kind of help some of those reps. But if we did that under our max effort, we would just fail to lift, right? So there's a ton of limitations, especially when you get to the more complex exercise. But we can still take principles from what is a front squat and what would we like to see in, say, a quad biased front squat. Like how would we like to see the knees relative to the hip for the center of the mass, right? Like where would we like to see, the bar placement, the torso angle. So what we can do is we can pull principles and then apply that to somebody's technique. But like if we're taking and say, looking at an EMG study on a whole bunch of people that did the front squat, I don't think that's very informative at all. What I do find more informative is when we take the same individual and we start manipulating their technique and we see, okay, how our leverages are changing. Do we see the recruitment or do we see the, oxygenation stuff, or do we see the force data going in the direction that we want? And that's essentially what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to say, hey, how predictable are our biomechanical models to these proxies when they should be applicable? And that kind of helps us get more confidence in the biomechanical model that we have. And so I'm basically using all these things to self-check, but you have to kind of look at that as like taking an individual and manipulating that. When it gets to complex exercises, I don't think we have the ability to generalize that very well. If anything, I mean, what you're going to have is you're going to have the people disagree with you because they don't experience that. And then you have some people like, oh, that's exactly what I feel. And then you just end up in these two camps and they're arguing about like, well, this is crap and this is good. And really this is just like, well, okay, where do they fit on the spectrum of that lift anyway? Like there's a lot of lifts, I think, where there's like this dichotomy of like, hey, what's this good for? Or is it good or bad or whatever? And if you look observationally, you can kind of almost guess what somebody's view of an exercise is sometimes based on the way that they're built, because you're going to be like, yeah, of course, if you do that exercise, you're probably going to experience it this way. If I see somebody and they got a really short torso, long ass femurs, right, and whatever, I'm going to be like, okay, yeah, their experience of the squat is going to be very different than somebody that's the opposite, that has long tibs and a long torso and short little femurs. They're going to have a totally different experience and totally different biofeedback the way they squat. And so likely those people are going to just gravitate towards the camp of how they feel about a squat. If they don't know that, well, the reason I feel this way or had this result is simply because this exercise, my leverages, work this way in it versus this other person is totally different.
Yeah. Helms, I'm sorry. I cut you off with that question. You looked like you were cooking.
Oh, I was actually just going to ask a real practical question because you brought it up and I have a feeling people will be curious about it. You were talking about making a leg press more or less glute or quad biased. How would you go about doing that?
Well, so where we place the foot is going to somewhat change the external levers to a degree. We're limited because it's a closed chain, meaning that friction is something that we still have to account for. So if we move the foot really low in a leg press, so that basically your heel's coming to your butt, what that does is it makes it so that our knee extension leverage is going to basically really be restricted there. So that it's going to be the weak point in the exercise. You're not going to be able to hip extend your way out of that because you can't remove the forces at the knee. Whereas if we put the foot up, now we could use more quad if we intentionally try to like push our like feet up towards the toes in our shoes, but we could also just kind of like push with our hip, and the knee extension can almost be a byproduct of the constraints, right? So because the foot is fixed and the hip is fixed, if we just do hip extension there, now we're in a situation where the knee's just going to extend, even if basically I Botoxed my quads, right? Now, is it zero quads? Well, for sure not, or your knee would fall apart, right? But like I said, because you can push up, you could also, if you wanted to, just do a leg extension. So technically, we could also Botox your glutes, and you could do it with isolated knee extension. It tends to feel really weird though, and so most people it just kind of works out that way. But sometimes you will actually have to also give an intention-based cue of maybe pushing a little bit more through your heels. You'll see this if you see people if you see the pressure in their foot change, their heels come off, et cetera, or sometimes you can actually just see people's ankles like sliding in their shoes, et cetera, enough. So something like that is going to, like, using a high position and kind of limiting any upward intention or push in the foot is going to allow us to basically do more of a just hip extension exercise in the leg press, versus at the bottom, basically we don't have that option, because even if the hips are pushing, they're not going to push that knee open as well. You're basically going to have to use the quads there. And it's respectively, like, you'll be able to see this experience, even like we'll say these things are very easy to experience because the magnitude of difference is so much. I mean, because you're basically doing a sissy squat in the leg press by the time you put your feet super low, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something where I have been, for the machines that allow you to do it, laying the leg press down as far as you can, putting my feet as low as I can, turning my toes out a little more, and just trying to get the most knee flexion possible, make it more quad dominant. And in traditional wisdom is you just put your feet up high and it makes it glute dominant. And it sounds like there's some wisdom in that.
Well, the higher you put your feet, the more weight you can use. And I think that's a big thing. And you could almost look at it through the lens, like if you're using a leg press for quads, like you could still, like say you could put your feet low enough. If you had really good ankle mobility, you might still be able to get to full knee flexion, and that's fine. But you might be in a position where you can still use a decent amount of glutes. So this would be in that category of like, okay, I want to train both at the same time. But you might also look at it through the perspective of like, okay, I want to grow my quads without having to put so much load through my hip joint. So I can use leverage instead of load and maybe, reduce some wear and tear on my hip joint because of the amount. I mean, if you're a really strong person, you're putting a lot of load to that hip joint, and you do that for years and years and years and years of training. Maybe I could, cut 30, 40% off that load just by simply using a lower foot position than I even needed, maybe going up on my toes, letting my heels come off, and work my quads just as hard. But the consequence is I will need to do direct work for my glutes if I wanted the same out of that, right? So is one approach better than the other? It's really pros and cons, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Man, all this talk about leg presses is bringing up a tough memory for me. Have either of you guys ever used the old hammer strength horizontal leg press machine? Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Horizontal one.
So
you're laying flat?
Well, no, it's like you're basically like kind of reclined. So you're not sitting totally upright, but you're like in a recliner and you're actually pushing the weight out horizontally. And the one that I used to use, it was so old school that the platform for your feet was actually carpeted, which was not a great idea for a gym. That's kind of disgusting. But man, it's like one of those things. Hammer strength had just like a few pieces of equipment that were just universally perfect. And they fell out of rotation in like 1986. And I would kill to go to a gym that just has that, because it would just get everything perfectly.
I have used this. There's another company that makes a similar one. Yeah, and it's so you're sitting and it's it kind of swings up and out, right?
Yeah. Oh man, it's beautiful. But I wish that like for my clients that want like to focus on leg development, especially if they have some lower back issues, which take your pick. Just about everybody does these days. Man, you could just tweak this and tweak that, tweak the other, just make these little subtle changes and target like any element of your lower body development. But man, the leg press got such a bad rap for a while, and it is such a beautiful piece of equipment. It's a shame that people try to especially back in the day when in the fitness world, everyone was doing the whole minimalist thing where it was like, oh, just squat's all you need, figure out a comfortable squat for you and you're good. But man, people just have such a limited frame of treating a leg press as if it's just one thing versus all these little adjustments that you can make to really tailor the experience. So just major props to the leg press, especially hammer strength in the 80s. Please come back.
Yeah. But I feel like the leg press doesn't get any love because it's not a thirsty exercise. It's so hard to get that filming angle that's going to get all the engagement that it just doesn't get the love that it deserves, today, because it's not social media friendly. And you worried me there for a second because I thought he was going to ask about the H press. I don't know if that's the one that you have to climb the stairs to use.
Oh, that one is ridiculous.
There's old videos of Kurt Widener getting in that, and it's like you watch him to take he climbs a ladder like he's jumping off a diving board before he does it.
Mm-hmm.
But
such a strange piece of equipment. That's
the first leg press type machine that I ever trained on. They had it at my old gym when I was in 7th grade, and you felt like you were launching off on a space shuttle. Like you climb up the big scaffolding, you're laying facing the ceiling. That thing was absolutely absurd.
It's actually biomechanical. It's a good motion, especially as a complement to a linear leg press because it kind of moves in a different direction. But engineering wise, there's a lot of ways to do the same thing with a much smaller footprint. And I think so. Unfortunately, we lost that movement pattern because of the poor engineering decision in the machine design.
Yeah, they must have quadrupled the amount of raw material they needed to produce that unit.
They could have, maybe they should have thought of like how they could have fit like another machine underneath, right? So like it could be like a 2-level thing. Somebody could be working in the bottom. Yeah, they did used to have those ones where it was a row and then a press on the other side. So I don't know why they couldn't have done it, right there.
Yeah, I hated those though, because to me it felt like a crappy row and a crappy press. Yes, they tried to make it. I was like, these suck.
No, I think it's really interesting when you start looking at different ways, and it does get a little more complex. Like for those who don't know, I recently was manipulating a leg extension in my training, and I put like just a wedge on the seat so I could be in hip extension. And Kassem messaged me. He's like, hey, like once you extend your hips, you're now getting less rotation about the knee. And I was like, I know. But what I did was I took this big pad and put it, in front of my shin so I could get more range there than the machine normally allows. And there is a question like, okay, well, I'm lengthening the rec fem, losing some range of motion for hip extension, gaining some back by adding the pad to my shin. But was it worth it? Because I could have added the pad to my shin while still be seated and got more range, but I wouldn't be lengthening my rec fem by lying back. And I think it is challenging that once you decide to like, all right, I'm going to take the pill, I'm going with you and out of the matrix, I'm going to try to optimize these exercises. You can get it wrong or make some changes that are actually not in favor of what you're trying to do when you leverage these principles. That's something you address a lot with people who start consuming your content, Kassem?
Yes, and I think biomechanics is one of those topics where if you have a rudimentary understanding, and same thing for physics and whatnot, it's almost like at that stage, you're almost more likely to screw it up and go down the wrong things, or at least it's a 50-50. So I feel like, if this is a field that you decide to try and learn in, just accept the ignorance early. And don't try and like apply every little thing that you learn, because until you get like the context, until you learn to be very, very thoughtful and try and consider all the things, you will spend a lot of time just doing a bunch of stuff that isn't necessary. And I think right now that's just like kind of like the scourge of this stuff on social media right now is everybody learns a little bit, and people will take our weekend course. And like within a week, they will be trying to like disseminate, the content on there. And of course, there's always stuff missing and whatnot. And a lot of times those are important things, or they're important considerations that get left out. So especially with the long muscle length thing now, right? Like that's important, maybe. But so many people are trying to manipulate exercises now to like, oh, hey, I want to get a longer muscle length. And I would say probably 70% will say things that I'd be like, you may have actually made the exercise worse there, or it may not have actually lengthened the thing that you want. I've seen everything from people like going to a longer muscle length, but now no longer having any load in that position. So it's kind of defeating the purpose, to people doing things where they're not actually lengthening the tissue that they're intending to. And then sometimes so say for instance, like a behind the back curl, I've seen people where it's just like, they just assume the higher the arm gets, that the more stretched the bicep is, but all of the motion is coming from scapular tipping. Right. And it's so like all you've done is you've just found a more unstable place to do a curl exercise from, because in the attempt of long being better, you essentially have just went into like we'll say a less optimal joint position to do the motion from, right? Or they'll set up the so we have a study comparing the preacher curl to the incline curl, right? And so in a preacher curl, we're shoulder flex, so it's a relative shorter position for the biceps from a shoulder perspective, But the benefit of the preacher curl is by having that brace under the arm, now when we're basically at full elbow extension, the dumbbell is still really challenging us at that lengthened or stretched position. Whereas in an incline curl, our shoulder is in an extended position where we're stretched, but there's very little resistance in the stretched position there. So if we were to take and use a cable and put it behind us and walk out, if that cable is still in line with our arm when it goes back, it's the same exercise as the incline curl. No matter how high your arm goes, if the cable isn't actually pulling, off angle from your forearm, if it's in line or very close to in line with your forearm, you're doing the same thing as the preacher curl, and you probably would still be better off. Like if you're really going for length bias, the preacher curl would still be better, right? So to give an example of kind of like, well, okay, but can we still improve upon that? One of the exercises that we show is that actually instead of, sitting behind the preacher curl and putting your arms out in front of you, just walk around and lay on the preacher curl as if it was an incline bench. And so now you're in a longer position to the shoulder than a regular preacher curl because your arm's basically going to be parallel to your torso, but you still have the benefit of the preacher curl now being, it's challenging in the lengthened position. Is it perfect? No, perfect would, if we do believe that lengthened, like the more lengthened is better, which I think there's probably a diminishing returns on this. I don't think that like, hey, if we get like, 1 more millimeter of length that that it would reach any level of significance. But if we did look at it as a scale of like, hey, the longer we can get this, there is some still incremental benefit. Well, then what you would need is an exercise that would basically get you to the degree of shoulder extension you wanted and was still hard at the bottom. And that means like you're going to have to like have your arm raced with a cable behind you so that basically your arm could be at shoulder extension and the cable can still be pulling kind of off angle. The reason that like so many things fail, I think, is that people look at one of these variables and then they just hone in on that. So if you're focusing on just muscle length and you don't get the challenge, or you don't understand that like you're adding instability to the exercise, it could be like, cool, I got there, but now really the volume load and the mechanical tension I'm accruing is significantly less because now I've just added all of this instability and this coordination demand. So I'm stopping 3 reps earlier than I would have had I had that stability before, right? So, this, I think, understanding how to balance these things, like you kind of have to be multidisciplinary of this, right? So it's like, okay, if we tiered these, right, we have applied research evidence showing that the preacher curl was a little bit better than the incline curl. So if we could do that lying preacher curl, where we're kind of getting almost the length of the incline curl, but still the loading benefits of the preacher curl, that would be better. And the opportunity cost, if you had the option to do the preacher curl, you have the option to do the other one. So it's like, okay, the opportunity cost is very, very, very low. If you wanted to optimize that further, you're probably going to have to do some specialized, elaborate setup to be able to get into that position. And while I can say, well, if we just are on the scale of if better, I could be like, yeah, it's like if I'm ranking these, the specialized, and we have posts showing this is like, okay, yeah, we got an arm behind. We're using like a roller attachment that you might use for like a Bulgarian split squat or something, and we're just using that as an arm brace and a cable, right, to basically get the loading and whatnot. But not everybody's going to have access to that or want to like replicate setting that up with a bench or whatnot. And so this is where then like, okay, for that level of difference, is it worth the time and effort? I mean, for me, having my own space, I mean, that's not a big deal. I just grab the thing off the wall, I put it there, cool. But like, we have a private space. If you're in a public gym or maybe you're at a home gym and you're trying to do multiple exercises and you don't want to have to be adding attachments on and off your functional trainer, et cetera, whatever, maybe it's like, hey, just take the win of you already know that like you're getting something relatively good rather than spending a lot of effort on something that might make a small difference. And then like the original question is like, hey, if you're not really sure, I would say be on the caution side before trying to make a bunch of changes. If you know like what you're doing right now is providing results. If you're stagnant, by all means, just try stuff, right? But if you're getting good results, I would say be cautious before you try and experiment things if you're not sure that you actually understand how all these things interplay with each other. Because I've seen a ton of people, try to do lengthened partials or lengthened bias stuff, and they're just kind of making exercises that likely are doing them a disservice.
No, I totally agree with that. And in some ways, I think the lengthened partial is actually easier to implement just on any exercise because you don't change the exercise, you just cut off the end range. And there are some exercises where they'll be far less effective than others where they're already challenged in the lengthened position. But I think that is one kind of idiot-proof way of it. Because you're not actually changing the fundamentals of the exercise. You're just going, I'm going to do the partial first portion. Of course, I would love to see more of the research, and I'm actually a partisan of that research that should be coming out. But, yep.
Okay. I'll share with you some of the, just little experiments. So I think we're close to now having put 100 students through this because we do this at our hypertrophy camp, where we basically have them compare volume load across doing different types of lengthened partials. So we do exclusively lengthened partials, we do lengthened partials at the end, and we do the integrated lengthened partials, which is where you alternate between, full range and partial reps. And we have them do this on a variety of exercises that span different challenges and different resistance challenges. And basically what ends up happening is if an exercise is extremely lengthened biased, they're not actually able to get any or a very insignificant amount of increase in volume load. So for instance, we do a dumbbell press, right? And most people don't get much more out of doing the lengthened partial than doing just the regular dumbbell press. And we have a prime pull down, which is we can make that thing super, super lengthened biased. And sometimes the majority of the people are, again, they get no benefit. But then if we switch to the cable version of the pull down, which they do it, so basically we do this between arms, right? So they'll do one arm with the prime pull down and one arm with the cable. We'll have people get double the repetitions when doing lengthened partials on the cable. And so we do this for a variety of exercises. And the exercises where you actually see the partials perform worse are usually exercises where there's some sort of respiratory limitation, or the lockout provides almost we'll say a break from occlusion. So leg press, for example, we actually see people get poorer performance doing lengthened partials than doing either full range or the integrated partials. The integrated partials seem to be a really good one for some of those exercises where you get a stack. So even the dumbbell press, sometimes the integrated partial is the best performing one because you still get every other rep, you still kind of get that lockout where maybe it's a little bit better for you to get a breath, reset your scaps, et cetera, whatever you're going to do. So for whatever reason, in some of those exercises where you get a stacking position, the integrated partials seem to really well outperform just the regular partials or be the same as the full range. And then for things like RDLs and squats and stuff like that, and some of those, then even the integrated partials may not perform any better. I think if we can accumulate more, I'm guessing that the loading parameters are going to have a big influence on that, right? Because it's okay, if we're doing a very low number of reps, well, then maybe we can get by with it. But as we start doing more reps, anything with a respiratory constraint, you're really going to miss those parts of the lift where you kind of get to let some blood flow and get a breath in, right? So that's where we've seen them not perform so well. And so right now, I don't think we have anything in the research that represents kind of that stacking element. There's the one study that uses the leg press, and that's the one study I think where they showed no difference between the length partial and the full range. And that partial was a really small partial, if I remember right? So I'm curious what that would look like if you did it as an integrated partial or something like that. But my guess is as we start to do more of the, get more exercises in here, that maybe we'll see more instances in these exercises where there's a stacking component or something where maybe there's not a difference, at least from a volume load proxy. We're seeing that doesn't seem to, they don't seem to do better there, or in some cases worse. And I can't think of a rationale for why a lengthened partial would work better if it actually decreased performance. Because I think one of the main impacts of doing the lengthened partial is it's increasing your amount of exposure you get in the lengthened position. But if because of a respiratory constraint, it actually decreased that exposure, it's hard for me to understand a mechanism of how that would be superior, if that would make sense. Like if the difference is that you would lose 2 reps doing the bottom of a squat, doing partials only versus doing full range, it's like, how would not getting those other 2 bottom reps not be better, if that makes sense? So I think...
Yeah, you're kind of looking at it as far as the number of lengthened exposures you get, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's exactly. I mean, that's exactly how we're counting the volume load. Is we're doing it as lengthened exposures. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that like I would think that would be correlated to the beneficial output. So yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. And so for those that don't know, an integrated partial just means that you get an opportunity to do a full range of motion rep in the midst of doing lengthened partials, kind of, and the same benefit that you would get just taking a breath and pausing before you do a few more squats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think a place where this adds value is, say you have clients or they have a machine, right? And you want to know, like, well, how challenging is that machine in the lengthened position for them? Like, you could actually have, use lengthened partials as a comparison, as a test. So basically, the more lengthened partials you can do, the less lengthened bias that exercise is organically. So if you're actually comparing exercises, like, because if I had the choice between doing lengthened partials and a cable pull down versus doing my pull down that is already lengthened, like has a lengthened bias challenge, I think that my lengthened bias challenge pull down would well outperform doing partials, because even those partials are still not hardest in the lengthened portion of the partial. They're still harder in the short portion of the partial. So I kind of look at it as like, you could actually use lengthened partials as a test, and the more partials you can get, the kind of worse that exercise is on its own. So either A, it makes it more important to do the lengthened partial, or B, maybe if you had a better exercise option that, like, if you were going for the lengthened bias, if you can do a lot of partials in it, probably you should just choose the other exercise option if your goal really was to bias the lengthened position. So we're kind of using that as an informative tool as well, because a lot of times people are like, oh, they're coaching somebody and they have a machine and like, I don't know what that machine feels like. It's got like 17 levers and pulleys and whatever. And if you're doing it yourself, it's very easy. You're just like, okay, where is it hard and how do I approach failure? But for a client, you could just be like, hey, as soon as you can't get a full rep, just see how many partials you can get after, right? And if it's like 6, then I'm like, okay, well, this exercise is definitely harder, more so towards the short position.
That totally makes sense. We've covered a lot of ground here. And Kassem, I want to just give you the floor a bit. If there's anything else you think would be beneficial to talk about, anything that you think were branches we didn't fully complete, or concepts that would be complementary to what we discussed, or things you're like, oh man, I wish we'd really gotten to talk about X, Y, or Z. Just want to open it up to you.
Well, I think, so one of the questions you had sent me originally was looking at like, okay, how, what are the applying principles for bodybuilding, et cetera. And I think talking about where the research fits in, especially for your audience, is probably important. And so when it comes to biomechanics, unfortunately, I think like there's a lot to be desired in terms of taking the research we have and trying to apply it to hypertrophy stuff. But the principles that you could get, that you can apply are very applicable, right? I mean, pretty much everything that we have in terms of inference on exercise, like, has some sort of biomechanical basis, right? It's like if we're doing elbow flexion, like we're like, okay, we know these things do elbow flexion, so kind of like that's where we're going. Bicep curls, yeah, probably train the elbow flexors. As you get into more of the more nuances, talking about like, oh, well, what if my shoulders are going back, or what if I'm pronating, et cetera? It's like that stuff becomes valuable once you actually care about which elbow flexors, right? So I think for a lot of people, like the message that I would like to give is context beats textbook. So when you're looking at anatomy, where the body's positioned, if you just look at that, is way more informative than the list of functions that you're going to see in a textbook or whatnot. Because in the textbook, you're going to listen and say like, okay, the pecs do internal rotation, they do transverse adduction, they do flexion, whatever. Extremely unhelpful, because all of those adjectives that we use in biomechanics are not very specific, and without context, they may or may not be true. So if you're gonna try and apply the stuff as a bodybuilder, I think first thing you need to do is learn anatomy, but don't learn it in 2D, learn it in 3D, and learn it contextually. And that means that, even if you get one of the fancy apps that's in 3D, what you really need to do is like just either move yourself or watch people training and exercise, pause it and be like, oh, hey, now that the arm is up in this position, how does that change which direction these muscles are pulling, right? Rather than relying on, okay, here's the list of functions in this, because they can literally be in opposition. And I think probably the biggest mistakes I see in terms of people making exercises or claims about exercises is like, well, this is a function of this muscle, therefore it does this. And, you could be like, okay, yeah, the lower pecs, do they do scapular depression? Well, yeah, they do depress this, but I've seen people show an example of that where they're literally pulling their shoulder blades back and down. And it's like, well, there's no instance in where the pecs are going to retract the shoulders, right? So the depression that they do is going to be in an anterior angle. So if you look at things in context and you look at, oh, okay, this muscle, here's its origin, here's its insertion, I can see the direction it would pull. When that textbook says this muscle does depression, it's going to do it when the arm is positioned in this place, and then that depression is actually going to be in this direction. So if I'm going to try and replicate on the gym floor, now I have that context that is much more specific to the exercise that I'm going to do. So if you're going to apply this stuff to bodybuilding, learn the anatomy. The anatomy is the foundation. If you have errors in your anatomy or it's not contextual, applying any biomechanical principle on top of that is then flawed, right? Like there's no point in applying a physics model to anatomy that doesn't actually exist. So that would be kind of my main thing of like, if anybody wants to apply this stuff, because most of the errors I think are because people are not looking at things contextually to the actual exercise, and they're not considering everything. So a lot of people like to isolate things to a single joint. So say, for instance, there's the argument about the pullover, right? Is it a pec exercise? Is it a lat exercise? And people argue about the leverages for shoulder extension and completely forget that both the pecs and the lats are also movers of the sternoclavicular joint. And that's actually the place where they have the largest lever, right? And so this exercise, we do have EMG data and other stuff to kind of like, oh, look at the mechanics and stuff for that. But a lot of times they'll get in an argument and it won't even be relevant, because arguably the primary function of the lats isn't even shoulder extension or shoulder. It's actually to move the sternoclavicular joint. That's its main function. And we have all these other things that do shoulder extension. So if you're going to want to argue about lats, we should probably argue about exercises that include its primary component rather than exercises where our lats are going to work in a pullover, sure, but it's shoulder extension by committee. Pecs are going to work, teres major is going to work, delts are going to work. Like all of these things are going to work, and they're going to work at different times. It's not an exercise that's super biased to anything. And if it's biased to anything, it's probably biased to the teres major because it's the best leveraged shoulder extension that we have, and it doesn't care at all about the sternoclavicular joint, which basically a pullover is isolating the glenohumeral joint, right? That's the whole point of that exercise, is leveraging that more. So if we have that context, we can solve a lot of these problems, but there's no point in arguing about them without that context. So those are the two things that I would put on. This is like, learn anatomy, but learn it contextually, right? And then when you're considering things, don't narrow your focus and lose the forest for the trees because you're looking at leverages or something at a single joint, forgetting everything else that's going on in an exercise.
Well said. Dr. Trexler, is there anything you want to add or questions you want to put in before we close this one out?
I got the highest grade in my class in my biomechanics course in grad school. So I just want to throw that in there. As you can tell from my many contributions in this discussion, it was not a very applied course. So I'm not able to bring a lot of tips and tricks out, but I just want the record to show that because I think it's funny. And I also think anyone who says after hearing this conversation, I'm going to jump into an academic biomechanics course. Well, buyer beware, because some of them are not quite as enthralling as talking about bodybuilding related applications. So you might want to read the syllabus before you commit.
Yeah, I would argue that you can almost get like a majority of the way learning some anatomy and physics free online in terms of bodybuilding than what you can in a university setting. Like none of mine were applicable either. So second it.
No, I think that's fair. And the way many anatomy courses are taught is exactly what you're describing, Kassem. It's like, here's the origin, here's the insertion, here's the action. Put all that together, and now you understand exercises, rather than contextualizing that with a basic understanding of, okay, like, but move your body into a position. And now what happens if that muscle shortens? What do your joints do? You know? And that is such a simple concept, but it's something that is often missing. And, you know, like I will sometimes, as I think through some of this, I'll just be like, all right, so if I'm here and that shortens, like, you kind of have to experientially get in there and do it sometimes. Because, you know, you take your person who just took their weekend course and you explain to them how at the initiation of a lat pull down or a pull up that their pec is contracting, and they're like, no, that's a back exercise. It's like, okay, like you just, it can be frustrating because once someone is given a list of answers in a textbook, it can ironically sometimes shut down critical thinking. Mm-hmm. So I think that is one of those really important things to do, is to provide that context. So I think that's a good message to leave people with, for sure.
I don't want to start an argument at the very end here, but I will say that I disagree. With anatomy, you really only need one position, and that's why they call it the anatomical position, right? That is the reference by which we should base all of our understanding. No, I really appreciate the scam that they're pulling there. Instead of dealing with the complication, like, no, we'll just name one position the anatomical position, and that will be the permanent reference from which we'll discuss. Beautiful.
It does make things easier, because then you can always, like, having a reference point, it is practically unhelpful and sometimes makes you intuitively wrong, but it does enable you to write things down, like this is the midline, or this is relative adduction or abduction. So I can understand its utility that you call a scam. I like it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it serves its purpose as a starting point, but it just, there's almost zero application to be had if you stop there.
Very well said. Well, I just want to thank you, Kassem, for taking the time to come on. I think hopefully this was a very informative conceptual lesson in how to apply some of these big picture principles. I think it'll be a nice companion piece to the episode we had with Dr. Wes Goodman. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening. If you have tuned in and you listened and you liked it, do us a favor and do the intuitive thing, far more intuitive than the anatomical position, and hit the like button. In addition to that, if you could do us the favor of leaving a rating and review, if you're unsure, most of the time we find people leave 5-star ratings. So that is a useful heuristic to follow. You know, it's not perfect, but if you like the show, leave a 5. That's simple. And if you are unsure about that, or it's not nuanced enough and you don't want to leave a 5-star rating, well, that's fine. Just think about that a lot and then eventually forget to leave any rating at all and just leave it with the thumbs up. And with that, I will say thank you, dear listener. Thank you, Coach Kassem. Thank you, Dr. Trexler. And everyone who is here in the Iron Cult, you can catch us next insert date here. We'll see you in that next episode.